Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Yuting and I'm a grad student at Princeton University. I'm going to present our paper A Delta Autodiff for Discontinuous Programs Applied to Shaders. This is collaboration with Connelly and Andrew Adams from Adobe Research and my advisor Adam Finkelstein from Princeton. Over the last decade, automatic differentiation or AD has greatly impacted optimization-based applications like deep learning and inverse rendering. Programmers can conveniently acquire gradients to their forward programs using frameworks such as TensorFlow, PyTorch, or JAX. These AD methods ignore program discontinuities, such as the if-else branching, and instead treat them as continuous. However, many programs, such as the shader renderings our application focuses on, intrinsically rely on discontinuities. For example, here we show a simple program that draws a circle. We have a discontinuous if-else branch to test whether a pixel is inside or outside the circle. If we want to optimize the radius and circle positions to best match the target image on the right, using AD will never converge because it outputs zero gradient to these parameters. One possibility is to use finite difference, but unlike AD, which is O1, finite difference scales linearly as the number of parameters grows. For example, here we write the shader to reconstruct this TensorFlow logo with 40 parameters. Clearly, using finite difference is very inefficient, and we won't show them here. Our method, on the other hand, accurately differentiates the discontinuities and allows efficient optimization that easily finds the optimal parameters that best match the target image. With the optimized parameters and the shader program representation, we could easily modify and animate the shader. For example, here, we could move the camera to show the geometry when the letter T and F are recognizable. In previous work, researchers have proposed several frameworks for correctly differentiating discontinuities. TAG is the first paper to differentiate arbitrary programs. However, the scope of the program they can handle is limited, excluding many real-world programs. For example, none of the programs in our paper can be handled by TAG except for the ones with specific design to compare with them. Additionally, for many programs, TAG rely on users to provide hues for function inversions and is only semi-automatic. Aside from TAG, many researchers have manually derived gradients for discontinuities on specific applications, such as for vector graphics or for 3D path tracers. They all work well in their individual domain, but the expressiveness of the framework comes from the massive number of parameters in the programs, such as the spline paths or vertices to triangle meshes. The discontinuity pattern, on the other hand, stays similar so that the manually derived solution can be used. As a result, it's hard to generalize these application-specific solutions to arbitrary program structures. Because of this, we propose A delta that extends reverse mode AD with gradient rules that can backpropagate gradients even through discontinuities. It is a fully automatic compiler framework and has no approximation error both theoretically and via quantitative error metric. If we compare with other methods like AD, finite difference, and TAG as we discussed before, AD is unable to sample discontinuities, and finite difference will be inefficient as its complexity scales to the number of parameters. In terms of expressiveness, while AD and finite difference can be applied to any programs, both ours and TAG are limited by the syntax of domain-specific languages, but ours can be applied to a much larger set of programs. We will first motivate our gradient rule and briefly discuss the general framework that can be used to differentiate arbitrary programs. In our framework, we always view the discontinuities as compositions of the Heaviside step function. This 1D function evaluates to 0 on the one side and is 1 on the other side, generating a discontinuity at the transition. In the theory of distribution, the derivative of the step function is a direct delta distribution. Informally, it evaluates to infinity at the origin and is 0 everywhere else. It can be approximated by any function sequence that integrates to 1 and approaches to the distribution in the limit. Because discontinuities are sampled with zero probability at a single point, we use a pair of evaluations to sample discontinuities. For a simple step function, we place one sample labeled as x plus and another sample labeled as x minus, both on the x-axis. Our rule approximates the derivative with respect to x using these two evaluation sites. Where did this rule come from? It can be derived by differentiating the function after prefiltering it with a 1D box kernel, as shown here. The distance between two evaluation sites can be viewed as the size of the box kernel. By moving the evaluation sites along the x-axis, the gradient of the prefiltered Heaviside step has a piecewise constant box shape on the right, which integrates to 1. You can see the area of the box on the right is 1. This approximates the direct delta in the limit when the kernel size goes to 0. In real-life programs, discontinuities usually depend on multiple variables, and like AD, we wish to differentiate with respect to all parameters in O1 time. For computational efficiency, our rule still prefilters with 1D kernels. In our framework, the kernel can be oriented along any axis, but it should be an axis that most discontinuities of interest would depend on. In this illustration, we show the kernel oriented along the x-axis. Here, we show an example that the Heaviside step function is a function of another 2D function, g of x theta, and we can still sample along the x-axis while keeping theta fixed. Similar to the 1D case, we draw two samples noted as the plus and minus. In the multivariate case, we need to additionally apply the direct delta scaling property to derive the correct result. This is our final rule for differentiating step functions, and similar to the 1D case, it's equivalent to differentiating the prefiltered function with the box kernel. Note that this is very different result than in AD, where the gradient is 0. We also designed other approximation rules to correctly differentiate discontinuities, which includes multiplication, addition, and function composition. Our sum rule is the same as in calculus, and the other two are presented in our paper. Their correctness can be verified by differentiating prefiltered functions where the same as previously, there are two evaluation sites, one on each endpoint. Our multiplication and function composition rule are different than AD and better handle discontinuities. Note this is a complete set of gradient rules, such that it can be used to build arbitrary computation. For a subset of programs, we are able to prove that our gradient approximation is first-order correct almost everywhere. We also designed a quantitative error metric that evaluates how much the approximation violates the gradient theorem. Please refer to our paper for details. Next, we will use the approximate gradient to explore possible applications in shader programs. Our main application is to optimize shader program parameters to match illustrations in the wild. Our first example tries to reconstruct this image that's inspired but different from the Olympic rings logo. We use a shader program that draws rings to reconstruct this image. Note, because of the interlocking pattern, the z-ordering of each ring is modeled as a linear function to the relative x coordinates. Therefore, it will be less straightforward to express this image in vector graphics pipeline, which require a user-specified constant for each primitive as the z-order. This is our optimization process that starts with random parameter values. Note, to avoid local minimum, we render 10 rings instead of 5. The final result looks pretty nice, except the interlocking pattern is slightly wrong. Let's see the target again. The interlocking pattern is challenging because the discontinuity is rarely sampled. For example, in the highlighted overlap region, every pixel actually agrees that the z-order for cyan blue ring is larger than the z-order for the olive ring. As a result, we do not get any gradient that tells the z-order parameters of the olive ring should be brought to the front. To solve the problem, we introduce per pixel random variable that adds to each parameter. This can be viewed as rotating the sampling axis presented earlier to stochastically prefilter along every parameter dimension. For example, if we apply random variable to every discontinuous parameter, we get this fuzzy shape. Discontinuities can be sampled for each pair of pixels with disagreeing color. Therefore, we can easily collect many samples that can contribute to an accurate gradient. This is the optimization process when we introduce random variables. The scale of the random variables are optimized as well, so they quickly converge to smaller values at regions they are certain about. This is the converged result, which is almost in pixel-wise perfect agreement with the target image. Our next example uses a similar shader to reconstruct this manually designed Celtic knot. This optimization is even more challenging because it lacks color hue to correctly position the rings. Nevertheless, the random variable helps us a lot in convergence. Note as the scale of the random variables quickly decreases, the rings also converge to correct positions. The convergence result is almost pixel-wise perfect and perfectly reconstructed the challenging interlocking pattern. Let's compare with target again. Similar to the TensorFlow example we shown at the beginning, we could modify the program and optimize parameters to animate the shader. For example, here we color and rotate each ring. Our last example reconstructs a SIGGRAPH logo. The geometry is generated by implicit surface functions with ring-marching loop. We designed a specialized gradient rule for the ring-marching loop that avoids differentiating through the arbitrarily long loop iterations. However, the specialized rule cannot be combined with random variables. Therefore, we disable randomness to any parameter that the ring-marching loop depends on. At convergence, we get this rendering that looks very similar to the SIGGRAPH logo. We now show an animation example to the optimized SIGGRAPH shader. Here, we combine our learned parameters with the displacement geometry by shader toy author IQ. The resulting animation both faithfully reconstructs the SIGGRAPH geometry and has this interesting new appearance as well. We also investigate the convergence behavior for 100 random restarts and compare with baselines. None of the state-of-the-art differentiable rendering methods can be applied because the shader program cannot be expressed in their frameworks. We therefore use two baselines, finite difference and SPSA. To best benefit baselines, each baseline is chosen from several variants with different hyperparameters, and we only report the variant with lowest error here. We first show the SIGGRAPH shader example. This is the error runtime plots for all 100 random restarts. The thicker plot represents the median of all restarts. Finite difference can also converge, but it's much slower because its gradient evaluation scales with the number of parameters. The SPSA baseline has even worse convergence. For a more challenging example, Celtic knot, only ours can converge, and both baselines are unable to find a reasonable minimum. In conclusion, we introduced this framework A delta that extends reverse mode AD to handle discontinuous programs. Our current framework requires a programmer with sufficient skill to abstract the scene and code in our DSL. For future work, we can set up some 2.5D or 3D workspace, such that the non-programmers are able to optimize their scene using basic primitives. Additionally, this project mainly focuses on shader programs. We believe other applications in different domains remain to be discovered, such as audio, physics simulation, and discontinuous losses for deep learning. With this, I'd like to conclude my talk. Thank you everyone for coming.